The wind in Jubilee Creek did not whisper. It shouted. It came off the Montana plains with a high, thin scream, carrying ice that stung the skin and tasted of nothing. It was the only sound Clara allowed herself to hear. She stood frozen on the packed dirt sidewalk outside the First Presbyterian Church, a small, white box of piety against a gray, churning sky. The town was behind her, but she could feel the heat of its gaze through her thin wool wedding dress. She was Mrs. Gideon Blackwood. She had been for 3 hours. She was a widow. She had been for 1. The ceremony was a blur of memorized words and the smell of stale whiskey on her new husband's breath. Gideon was 50, weathered, with hands like knotted pine. He owned 3,000 head of cattle and the respect of men who feared him. He had looked at Clara not with affection, but with the flat, assessing eye of a man buying livestock. Now he was dead. The news had come via the deputy, a young man named Harris, who could not meet her eyes. There had been a celebration at the Red Dog Saloon. Bragging. A disagreement over a hand of cards. A younger, drunker man had called Gideon a name. Gideon had shoved. The man had shoved back. Gideon Blackwood, the man who had survived blizzards, cattle raids, and a Kiowa arrow, had fallen backward and struck his head on the corner of the cast-iron stove. He never got up. Clara held the collar of her dress. It was borrowed. Everything was borrowed. "It is a curse," she heard someone whisper from the porch of the Mercantile. It was Mrs. Abernathy, pulling her shawl tight. "A walking, breathing curse. First Mr. Monroe, taken by the fever before they even had a child." Another voice, Mrs. Sweeney, the undertaker's wife, added. Her voice was not unkind, merely stated fact. And now Mr. Blackwood, before she was even truly a wife. "Shameful," Mrs. Abernathy said, and the word hit Clara like a slap. Twice widowed and not yet 23. What decent man would have her now? Clara's first husband, Thomas, had been gentle. He had been kind. They had shared 2 years in a small sod house, full of laughter and hardship, before the fever took him in 3 days, leaving her with nothing but a tintype and a debt at the Mercantile she could not pay. That debt was what led her to Gideon Blackwood. Mrs. Abernathy had arranged it, calling it Providence. Clara called it a sale. Now she was neither wife nor widow. She was just a spectacle, a ghost in a gray wool dress. She knew what came next. The pitying looks, the offers of housework in exchange for a cot in a cold attic, the assessing glances from lonely ranchers and drifters who saw a woman unowned, available, and desperate. She looked up at the sky. The clouds were low and heavy, the color of a fresh bruise. Snow was coming. A real storm. The deputy, Harris, approached her, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Blackwood, ma'am, the body is at Sweeney's. Gideon's nephew from Cheyenne is his next of kin. We sent a wire, but, well, ma'am, your room at the boarding house." He did not need to finish. Her room was paid for by Gideon. That contract was now as void as her marriage vows. She had no claim on the Blackwood Ranch. She had no money. She had no home. "I understand, deputy," she said. Her voice was brittle, thin as the ice forming on the water trough. "Ma'am, the ladies of the church, they said you could—" "No," Clara said. She said it not to him, but to the wind, to the town, to the fate that kept trying to bury her. "Thank you. I will manage." She turned and walked, not toward the boarding house, but away from the church. She ignored the whispers. She walked past the Red Dog Saloon, where 2 men were already swabbing the floor. She walked past the Mercantile, its windows glowing yellow and warm, a life she could not enter. She went to the boarding house, up the back stairs. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, was waiting in the hall, her arms crossed, her face a mask of anxious pity. Clara Dear, I heard it is just terrible. But you see, Mr. Blackwood. I am leaving, Clara said, pushing past her into the small, cold room. It was not hers. It had never been. She opened the wardrobe. The gray wedding dress was the only thing of value she possessed, and she hated it. She stripped it off, her skin raising in goose flesh, and threw it onto the bed. She pulled on her old brown skirt, a flannel shirtwaist, and the patched coat Thomas had worn. She took her single carpet bag. Inside, she placed her last pair of wool socks, her mother's silver locket, a small, worn Bible, and the tintype of Thomas, his smile so young it hurt her chest to see it. She had half a loaf of bread left from breakfast. She took that, too. She walked back downstairs, past Mrs. Gable, who was already weeping into her apron. But child, where will you go? In this, it is snowing. West, Clara said. It was the only answer she had. She stepped out onto the street. The wind hit her instantly, sharp and cruel. The sun was a pale smear in the west, and the first hard flakes of snow were beginning to drive horizontally down the street. She pulled her collar tight, put her head down, and walked. She did not look back. She would not be pitied. She would not be claimed. She would rather let the prairie take her than let the town bury her alive. 50 miles north. Jesse Klein pushed his face deeper into the sheepskin collar of his coat. The wind found every seam. He had been tasting snow for the last 2 hours, and now the world had dissolved into a churning whiteness that erased the horizon. His horse, a tough bay gelding named Silas, stumbled and let out a low groan. Easy, boy, Jesse murmured, his voice rough from days of disuse. I know, just a bit farther. Silas was limping. A rock in a frozen riverbed 2 days back had bruised the frog of his left forehoof, and the cold was making it worse. Jesse's supplies were gone, save for a handful of coffee beans and the last inch of whiskey in his flask. He had delivered the herd to Fort Keogh, collected the pay, and was just trying to get home. Home. The word felt like ash in his mouth. Home was a one-room cabin tucked into the foothills of the Wolf Mountains, a place that smelled of pine smoke and guilt. He had not been there in 2 months. He was not sure he could stand the quiet again. But the wilderness was the only place that did not look at him with judgment. He pushed his gloved hand against the heavy weight at his hip. The Colt revolver was cold, even through the leather. It was his constant companion, his burden. He had worn it every day for 3 years, since the feud over water rights turned hot. Since the day he and his younger brother, Eli, had stood on opposite sides of a wire fence. It had been chaos, shouting, dust, the crack of rifles. Jesse saw a man aim at Eli. He fired. The man went down, but Eli had staggered, looked down at his own chest, and then looked at Jesse. It was not Jesse's bullet that killed him. He knew that. He told himself that every day. The shot had come from the other side, from one of the rancher's men. But Jesse had been there. He had brought the gun. He had been part of the war that killed his only brother. The law called it manslaughter, a charge lost in the confusion of the range war. But Jesse called it by its right name. The gun was heavy. It was always heavy. The light was failing fast, the world turning a deep, bruised purple. The snow was thickening, piling against the sagebrush. Silas stumbled again, harder this time, and Jesse swung down. He could not ride him. All right, boy, we walk. He took the reins and leaned into the wind, his head down, following the frozen line of the creek. He was still 10 miles from his cabin. They might not make it. The cold was a living thing now, wrapping around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He saw her first as a dark shape against the snow, a mound near the creek bed that did not belong. He thought it was a downed calf, maybe a deer. He pulled the Winchester from his saddle scabbard, his fingers numb on the steel. He moved closer, squinting through the driving snow. It was not a calf, it was fabric. It was a person, He ran the last few yards, his boots sinking deep. She was lying on her side, half curled, a small carpet bag clutched in one hand. She was wearing a skirt and a man's coat. Her face was gray-white, her lips blue. Jesse knelt, touching her shoulder. "Ma'am?" She did not move. He shook her, harder. "Ma'am, you cannot sleep here. You will die." Her eyes fluttered open. They were wide, vacant with cold and confusion. Then they focused on him, on his beard, his size, the gun at his hip. Terror flashed across her face. It was a raw, animal terror. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "No, please." She tried to scramble away, but her limbs would not obey. She raised a hand, swatting at him weakly. Do not touch me." "Easy," Jesse said, holding his hands up. I am trying to help you. There is a storm, a blizzard." "Liar," she hissed, though the word had no strength. She believed he meant to harm her, to take her, to do her violence out here where no one would ever hear her scream. She saw the end of her life, not in the cold, but in the hands of this strange, rough man. "Madame, you are freezing to death." He reached for her, and she clawed at his coat, a desperate, dying defense. He ignored it, sliding one arm under her back and the other under her knees. She was lighter than a sack of feed. "No," she cried, but the sound was stolen by the wind. She fought him weakly for another moment, her fists beating against his chest, and then her head fell back. She lost consciousness. Jesse looked at her, then at his limping horse. He looked at the sky, which was now black. "Damn," he whispered. He secured the carpet bag to his saddle, adjusted the woman's weight in his arms, and turned into the wind. He could not leave her. It was not in him. He could not carry another death. It took him 3 hours to reach the cabin. 3 hours of walking through knee-deep drifts, the wind trying to rip her from his arms. Silas followed behind, exhausted. Jesse's arms burned. His back screamed, but he did not stop. The woman in his arms was a dead weight, her breathing shallow. He saw the dark line of his cabin roof against the snow and nearly wept. He kicked the door open, the leather hinges groaning. The cabin was ice cold, darker than the storm. It smelled of Eli's old tobacco and wood smoke gone cold. He carried her straight to the cot in the corner, his cot. He laid her down gently on the straw tick mattress, pulling the thick buffalo hide over her. He moved with a desperate, practiced efficiency. He lit the lantern, the small flame chasing the worst of the shadows. He threw kindling and 2 split logs into the stove, coaxing a flame to life. He went back out, leading Silas into the small lean-to, rubbing him down with a dry sack, giving him the last of the oats. Then he went back inside. The stove was beginning to throw heat, a small circle of warmth in the roaring dark. The woman had not moved. He stood over her, uncertain. She was soaked. Her boots were frozen solid. He could not leave her like that. He worked clumsily, his fingers stiff. He pulled off her boots. They were cheap, worn flat, and soaked through. Her socks were thin cotton. Her feet were raw, blistered, and bruised a dark purple at the toes. He looked away, his jaw tight. He pulled the wet coat off her, leaving her in the flannel shirtwaist and skirt. He covered her again with the buffalo hide and 2 more wool blankets. He found an old, clean shirt of his own and laid it near the stove to warm. He spent the rest of the night in the cabin's only other chair, a rickety thing Eli had made from willow branches. He fed the fire, listening to the blizzard try to tear the cabin apart. The wind did not stop screaming. He watched the woman breathe. He did not sleep. Clara woke to 2 sensations, warmth and pain. The warmth was a miracle. It wrapped around her, heavy and safe. The pain was a dull throb in her hands and a sharp sting in her feet. She opened her eyes. The light was gray. She was not on the prairie. She was in a room, small and dark, the walls made of rough-hewn logs. The air smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A massive buffalo hide was piled on top of her. She heard a small sound, metal on wood. She turned her head. He was there, the man from the snow. He was sitting on a low stool by the fire, his back to her. He was large, broad-shouldered, with dark, shaggy hair. He was doing something with a pan of water. Fear shot through her, cold and absolute. She tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed. She was in a stranger's cabin, alone. He heard her move. He stopped, his shoulders tensing. He stood up slowly and turned around. He was younger than she had thought. His face was hard, covered in a dark beard. But his eyes were tired. They were the saddest eyes she had ever seen. He held a strip of clean cotton rag in one hand. He did not move toward her. "You are safe," he said. His voice was low, a rumble. "The storm is still bad. You were near frozen when I found you." Clara stared at him, pulling the buffalo hide up to her chin. She looked down. She was still in her shirtwaist and skirt. Her wet coat and boots were by the stove, steaming. My feet," she whispered. He nodded, looking not at her, but at the floor. "They are bad, blistered. The cold got to them. I need to wrap them." He took a step. Clara flinched, pulling her legs back. He stopped immediately. "I will not harm you, ma'am." He placed the pan of warm water and the rags on the floor, then pushed them toward the bed with his foot. He retreated to the stove, turning his back to her again, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "You should tend them," he said, his back still to her. "The water is clean." Clara watched him. He was giving her privacy. Her fear did not vanish, but it shifted. It made room for a deep, burning shame. She was helpless, a beggar. She grit her teeth and swung her legs over the side of the cot. The pain in her feet was sharp, like walking on needles. She looked down. Her feet were red and swollen. Her hands were just as bad, the skin cracked and bleeding from where she had fallen. She dipped a rag into the warm water, wincing as it touched her skin. She began to clean her feet, her movements clumsy. "There is coffee," he said, still not looking, "and some jerky. It is all I have until the storm breaks." "Thank you," she said. The words felt foreign. I do not know who you are."
"Jesse," he said. "Jesse Klein. This is my place."
"Clara Monroe," she said, then paused. "Clara, just Clara." She could not bear the name Blackwood. He finally turned, holding out the tin cup. She took it, her raw hands trembling around the hot metal. The coffee was black and bitter, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. "I must leave," she said, echoing her words from the day before. "When the storm clears." Jesse looked at the single window. It was covered in ice, but beyond it, the world was a solid, howling white. "That will not be today," he said, "or tomorrow." The storm did not break. It settled. For 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The wind was a constant, screaming presence. It groaned against the logs, and fine, powdery snow sifted through the cracks in the door frame. The isolation was absolute. They lived in silence. It was a heavy, awkward thing. Jesse slept rolled in his blankets by the stove, giving her the bed. He spent his time splitting wood from the small pile he kept inside, tending his horse in the lean-to, or just staring into the fire. Clara stayed on the cot, her feet wrapped in his clean rags. She watched him. He was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of a man holding his breath. He never spoke unless she spoke first. He ate his jerky standing up, his back to her. He kept his distance. But she would feel his gaze. She would be rubbing her hands, trying to work the stiffness out, and she would look up. He would be watching her. His eyes were not hungry, like Gideon Blackwood's had been. They were not pitying, like the town's. They were assessing. He seemed to be looking right through her skin, at the broken bits inside. When he caught her looking, he would turn away sharply, as if ashamed. On the third day, the silence was so loud it felt like shouting. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. Clara knew she had to leave. She also knew that if she stepped outside that door, she would be dead in an hour. She was trapped by the storm, trapped with a stranger whose sad eyes made her more nervous than any threat could have. The blizzard did not break. It settled in, a gray shroud over the world, and the wind's high scream dropped to a constant, grinding moan. The cabin, which had at first felt like a fortress, began to feel like a tomb. Clara could not lie on the cot any longer. Her feet, though still tender and wrapped in strips of Jesse's old shirt, could bear her weight. The shame of her helplessness was a sickness in her stomach. She was a burden. She was eating his food, sleeping in his bed, breathing his air. On the morning of the fourth day, she swung her legs to the floor, the cold wood stinging her. Jesse was by the door, staring out the small, ice-caked window at the white nothing beyond. He had been standing there for an hour. "I need to," she started, her voice rough. He turned, startled, as if he had forgotten she was there. "I need to help." He just looked at her. His gaze was heavy, unreadable. "There is nothing to do." "There is," she insisted. She walked stiffly to the woodpile stacked by the stove. She picked up the small, worn broom. "I can sweep." It was a small, useless gesture. The floor was packed earth, but she swept anyway. The scratching of the straw bristles a relief against the howl of the wind. After that, a silent routine was established. He no longer treated her as a patient. He treated her as a shadow. When he went out to the lean-to to feed Silas, fighting the snow-choked door, she would tidy the cabin. She organized his few tins of food on the shelf, mostly beans and salt. She folded the blankets on the cot. She found his mending kit in an old ammunition box. She sat in the willow chair, the one he usually occupied, and mended his coat. The sheepskin collar was torn. She stitched it with a thick thread, her fingers clumsy from the cold and the blisters. She was holding his coat. She was holding something that belonged to him, that held his shape. She could smell the faint, sharp scent of him on the wool, pine smoke, horse, and something metallic, like old iron. She pulled the thread tight, her stomach twisting. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to choke on. They were two people in a box barely 12 feet square. They moved around each other with a desperate, practiced care. A brush of the shoulders as he passed her to feed the stove, his fingers grazing hers as he handed her a tin cup of coffee. Each small, accidental contact was a jolt, a spark in the frozen air. It was not fear, not anymore. Clara knew this man would not harm her. His gentleness in tending her feet, his averted gaze, his quiet insistence on giving her the bed, these were not the actions of a brute. It was something else. It was an awareness. It was the knowledge that they were a man and a woman, alone, with the entire world erased outside the door. Every small kindness felt dangerous. A log laid on a fire that both of them were terrified to light. One evening, the silence was broken by the sharp hiss of boiling water. Clara was moving the heavy iron kettle from the stove, intending to pour some into the basin to wash their few dishes. Her left hand, still stiff and slick with the salve Jesse had given her, slipped on the handle. The kettle tilted. Scalding water splashed over the side, directly onto her right hand. Clara cried out, a sharp, breathless sound, dropping the kettle to the floor. The pain was immediate. A bright, white fire. Jesse moved. He was not the slow, quiet man from the shadows. He was across the cabin in one long stride, a blur of motion. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not hesitate. He seized her right wrist. His grip was like a steel trap, hard and absolute. Clara gasped, the shock of his touch as sharp as the burn. Before she could process it, He plunged her entire hand into the wooden bucket of snowmelt water they kept by the door. The cold was a mercy, instantly killing the fire. She stood there, frozen, his hand locked around her wrist, her own hand submerged in the icy water. She was trembling. He was trembling. She looked up at him. His face was inches from hers. She could see the lines etched around his eyes, the gray at his temples. He was looking at her burned hand, his jaw clenched, his breathing ragged. "Keep it there," he said, his voice a low command. But Clara was not feeling the cold. She was feeling the pressure of his fingers on her pulse. It was the first time a man had touched her in purpose, not in pity, not in purchase. Since Thomas, the strength in his grip was terrifying, and it was steadying. She pulled back, yanking her wrist from his grasp, though she left her hand in the water. "Do not," she whispered, her voice shaking. He stepped back immediately, his hands raised slightly, as if to show he was unarmed. "Your hand." "Do not," she said again, louder this time. She looked at him, and her eyes were not angry. They were filled with a desperate, terrible warning. "You will regret touching me," she said, the words flat, heavy. "Everyone does." The air in the cabin changed. It was as if the storm had finally breached the walls and was howling between them. He stared at her, not in confusion, but with a sudden, terrible understanding. He saw the curse she carried. He nodded. Once. A short, sharp movement. He turned away from her and went back to the window, his shoulders rigid. Clara was left by the bucket, her hand numb, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that returned was no longer awkward. It was raw. They had seen something in each other, a shared brokenness, and now there was no hiding from it. That night, she could not sleep. The wind howled and the fire crackled, and Jesse sat in his chair, cleaning his revolver. The quiet click, click, click of the metal was the only sound. Clara lay in the dark, the pain in her hand a dull throb, and allowed herself to remember. She remembered Thomas. His hands were not hard like Jesse's. They were thin, calloused from the plow, but gentle. He had loved books. He read to her in the evenings in their sod house, his voice warm. He had brought her a cluster of prairie crocus in their first spring, his face bright with the simple gift. Then came the fever. It came on the wind from the east, and it settled deep in his lungs. She remembered the smell of the sick room, vinegar and sweat. She remembered boiling rags, trying to force broth between his cracked lips. He had died in the middle of the night, his last breath a thin rattle. She had held his cooling hand for hours, begging him not to leave her alone. He had left her anyway. She was 21, she was a widow, and she was in debt. The town, which had seemed friendly, turned cold. Pity was a thin gruel, and it ran out fast. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, had come to her. "Clara, you are a practical girl," she had said, her hands folded over her ample stomach. "A woman alone, especially a pretty one. You are a temptation. You are a target. It is not right, but it is the truth." "I can work," Clara had insisted, though her hands were raw from taking in laundry. "And earn what? Enough for a room? Enough for food? Gideon Blackwood is a good man, a provider. He is lonely. He needs a wife to keep his house." "He is old," Clara had whispered, ashamed. "He is respectable," Mrs. Abernathy corrected. "He will give you a home. He will give you his name. It is a good arrangement. It is Providence. Child." It was a sale. She had stood in that church, wearing a borrowed dress, and let herself be sold to pay for Thomas's coffin and a winter's worth of flour. And then Gideon died, in a bar brawl, over cards. The town did not see it as an accident. They saw it as the mark. Mrs. Sweeney, the undertaker's wife, had looked at her with wide, fearful eyes. "The curse," she'd whispered. Clara pressed her burned hand against her mouth. She was a curse. Thomas was dead. Gideon was dead. And now she was here, bringing her poison into this quiet man's home. "You should sleep," Jesse's voice came out of the dark. She startled, sitting up. He had not moved from the chair. The gun was reassembled on his lap. "I cannot," she said. He was quiet for a long time. The fire cast deep shadows across his face. "Me neither," he said finally. "Why are you here?" she asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. "So far from everything. This is not a place to live." "It is a place to be," he said. He ran a thumb over the wooden grip of the Colt. "When you cannot be anywhere else." "You are hiding," she said. It was not an accusation, just a fact. He looked at her. His eyes seemed to capture the last of the firelight. "Is that not what you were doing, out there in the snow?" She flinched. "I was not hiding. I was leaving." "Same thing." He put the gun back in its holster. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "We all have things we are running from. Ma'am, you, me." He paused, and his voice dropped so low she could barely hear him. "I have done things I cannot undo, things that do not wash off." Clara watched him. His words resonated with her own guilt. Things that do not wash off. She thought of Gideon, falling. She thought of the whispers. "I know," she whispered. He looked up, surprised. He had expected denial, or questions. He had not expected agreement. In that moment, the distance between the cot and the chair shrank. They were not just a man and a woman. They were two confessions, sitting in the dark. The cold deepened. The wind did not stop for a week. The snow was piled to the roof on the north side of the cabin. The food, which had been scarce, became precious. They were down to half a sack of beans and a small amount of jerky. They ate once a day, in the evening, sharing the small pot in silence. The hunger made them weak. The cold was a constant ache in their bones, but it was the filth that began to wear on Clara. The cabin was small. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the faint, stale smell of their confinement. She felt dirt on her skin, in her hair. It was a violation. It was the last piece of her dignity being stripped away. On the 8th day, she made a decision. Jesse was outside, clearing a path to the lean-to, the rhythmic thud of his shovel muffled by the snow. Clara pulled the round tin hip bath from under the cot. It was small, meant for sitting in. She dragged it near the stove. She began stuffing the stove with wood. When Jesse came back in, his beard caked with ice, he stopped dead. He saw the tub. He saw her, her face set in a look of grim determination. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I need to wash," she said, not looking at him. He stared at her as if she were mad. "Ma'am?" "Clara, it is 10 degrees below zero. We cannot spare the wood. It is foolish." "I do not care," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with intensity. I cannot live like this. I need to be clean." He saw the desperation in her eyes. It was not about comfort. It was about survival. It was a fight against the wilderness that was trying to turn them into animals. He sighed, the sound a plume of white vapor. He kicked the door shut. "It will take hours to heat that much water." "Then we will start now." He did not argue again. He saw that this was a line she would not cross. The work was hard. They packed the stove with wood until it glowed red hot, the cabin becoming stifling. They hauled in buckets of snow, melting them one by one in the kettle, pouring the steaming water into the tub. It took 2 hours. The air grew thick with steam, the windows completely fogged over. Jesse worked with his back to her as much as possible. He was awkward, clumsy, his face dark with a flush that was not from the heat. He was acutely aware of what was happening. He was preparing a bath for a woman who was not his wife, in the same room where he slept. When the tub was finally half full, the water steaming, Jesse grabbed his coat. "I will check on Silas," he muttered, his hand on the door latch. "No," Clara said. He stopped. "You cannot," she said, her voice small. "If you open that door, the heat will be gone. The water will be ice before I am done." He turned slowly. He understood. He was trapped. He would have to stay. He looked at her, his face a mask of discomfort. "Clara!" "Turn your back," she said, the words a plea, not an order. "Please, Jesse, just turn your back." He did not move to the chair. He went to the door and stood facing the wood. His hand braced against the log wall, as if holding it up. He was a sentinel, guarding her privacy with his own rigid discomfort. Clara's hands were shaking. She unlaced her boots. She peeled off the filthy rags that served as socks. She unbuttoned her shirtwaist, her skin crawling. The air was hot, but she was shivering. She could feel his presence, a solid breathing wall of muscle and shadow just feet away. She let her skirt fall to the floor. She stood in her thin chemise, her arms crossed over her chest. "Jesse," she whispered. "I am not looking," he said, his voice rough. "I know. It is. My feet, they are still sore. The tub is high." She was afraid of slipping, afraid of falling. He did not turn. He said nothing. I might need help," she stammered, ashamed of her weakness. He remained frozen, his back to her. He was torn. To turn was a violation. To refuse was cruelty. Clara took a breath. She would do it herself. She lifted one foot over the high tin wall of the tub. She balanced. She lifted the other, and her sore foot slipped on the wet metal bottom. "Oh!" she cried out, losing her balance, reaching out blindly to stop her fall. He turned. He had to. He saw her, a pale shape in the steam, her arms flailing. He lunged, not thinking, grabbing for her. Clara did not grab his arm or his shoulder. Her hand, the one she had burned, shot out and seized his. Her fingers locked with his. She caught her balance. She was standing in the tub, the hot water rising around her ankles. She was holding his hand, and she did not let go. Jesse froze. He was staring at their joined hands. Her skin was pale and soft against his rough, dark knuckles. He could feel the tremor in her fingers. He could feel her pulse, fast and frightened, against his palm. He looked up, but only as high as her shoulder. He averted his gaze, turning his face toward the fire, his neck burning. He was trembling. He was caught between a lifetime of guilt, a deep-seated respect, and a sudden, sharp longing that punched the air from his lungs. He wanted to pull his hand away. He wanted to hold hers forever. He felt damned for even being in the room. Clara stared at their hands, this large, calloused hand that had dug her out of the snow. The hand that had plunged hers into ice water. It was strong enough to kill, and it was holding hers as gently as if it were spun glass. She was aching, not for passion, not for what Gideon had wanted. She was aching for warmth, for a simple, human touch that was not a precursor to pain or loss. She held his hand for a long, silent moment. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the roar of the wind. Finally, her grip loosened. She slid her hand from his and slowly sank down into the water, the steam rising to fog her face. Jesse pulled his hand back as if he, too, had been burned. He turned, his movements jerky, and went back to the door. He did not face the wood this time. He faced the room, but he looked at the floor, his chest heaving, his jaw set so tight it ached. Clara washed, her movements small and quiet in the water. The heat was a miracle, but it was not the water that had made her feel warm. It was the trembling hand she had held, and the fact that he had looked away. It started not with a sound, but with the absence of one. The high, constant scream of the wind did not stop, but it fell, shifting from a howl to a low, grieving moan. Then, another sound took its place. Drip. It was the sound of a single drop of water falling from the eaves onto the packed snow below. Drip. Clara heard it when she woke. The cabin was cold, colder than it had been, because the fire had burned low. Jesse was not in his chair. He was at the door, his hand on the latch, listening. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of the world returning. It was the sound of the end. For 9 days, the cabin had been a world unto itself, a ship frozen in a white sea. The storm had been their jailer, but it had also been their protector. It kept the outside world at bay. Now, the world was cracking open. Hope flickered in Clara's chest, thin and sharp. She could leave. She could walk away. She could be free. The hope was followed by a cold, immediate dread. Leave and go where? Back to Jubilee Creek, to the whispers and the pity. Back to being the town curse. And what of the man standing at the door? He had saved her. He had shared his last handful of beans. He had held her hand in the dark and looked away. The thaw made them strangers again. Jesse opened the door. The wood, swollen with ice, scraped against the frame. A shaft of weak, gray light cut into the room. It was not the bright, sharp light of a clear winter day, but the watery, exhausted light of a long sickness breaking. The air that flowed in was not the biting cold of the blizzard, but a damp, heavy chill that smelled of mud and wet pine. "It is breaking," he said, his voice rough. He did not look at her. "How long?" she asked, rising from the cot. 2 days, 3, the drifts are high, but it is breaking." He grabbed the shovel. "I need to clear the roof, or the weight will bring it down." He was gone all morning. Clara was left alone in the cabin, the sound of his shovel scraping on the roof above her, the steady drip, drip, drip from the eaves marking the time. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had. It felt lonely. She went to his coat, the one he had worn to rescue her. It was dry now, hanging from a peg by the door. She had mended the collar. She had stitched a tear in the sleeve. But the pocket, the left breast pocket was heavy, sagging with something she had avoided. She had told herself it was his private business. Now, with the world returning, she needed to know. Her hand trembled as she slid it inside. Her fingers brushed against cold metal, a few cartridges, and a small, oilskin-wrapped pouch. Beneath that was a piece of paper, folded, small, and stiff. She pulled it out. It was cheap paper, creased and worn, damp from the snow it had endured. She unfolded it. The letters were black and stark. Wanted. Below it, the name Jesse Klein. Her breath caught. She read the words, her blood turning to ice, colder than any snow. For questioning in the matter of manslaughter during the Clear Fork Range conflict, $100 reward for information leading to his arrest. Manslaughter, a killer. She was in a cabin, miles from anyone, with a man wanted for killing. She sank onto the cot, the paper shaking in her hand. She thought of his quietness, his sad eyes, the gun he cleaned every night. She thought of his large, calloused hands, and how he had flinched when she touched him. She heard the scrape of his boots outside, panicked. She folded the paper, her fingers clumsy, and shoved it back into the pocket of his coat, just as the door swung open. He came in, his face wet with melted snow, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He looked at her, then at the coat. He saw her hand pull away from it. His eyes, which had been so tired, sharpened. They became the eyes of a hunted thing. He did not move. He did not speak. He just watched her. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice a whisper. He said nothing. He just looked at the coat. "The poster," she said. "I saw it. Jesse Klein." His face, what she could see of it behind the beard, tightened. He looked away from her, toward the fire. He seemed to brace himself. "It says manslaughter," she said, her heart hammering. "It says you killed a man." He took a long, slow breath. The sound of the dripping water filled the silence. "That is what they call it," he said. his voice flat. "Did you?" He turned to her, and the sadness in his eyes was so deep, so absolute, it eclipsed her fear. "Yes," he said. Clara's stomach dropped. "Who?" Jesse sat down heavily in the willow chair. He did not look like a killer. He looked like a man at his own funeral. He stared into his hands for a long time. "There was a feud," he said, his voice so low she had to lean forward. "Over water rights, the big ranchers, the Bar T outfit. They started fencing off the Clear Fork. It was open range. It was Eli's range." "Eli?" My brother, my younger brother." The name came out of him like a stone. Eli was hot-headed. He was not a man to be pushed. He cut their wire. They came for him. He paused, swallowing. I was not like him. I just wanted to work our small claim. But they came for him, and he was my blood. So I rode with him. It was me and Eli, and 4 other smallholders, against 12 Bar T riders. He stopped, his gaze lost in the fire, seeing not the flames, but the dust and the gunfire of a day 3 years gone. "It was a mess, yelling, shooting. The air was full of smoke. I saw one of them, a man named Cogan, draw down on Eli. I fired. Cogan went down. But Eli—" Jesse's voice broke. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. Eli was on the ground. He had turned. He was right in the line of Cogan's fire, but Cogan did not shoot him. I saw the shot. It came from our side. He looked at Clara, his eyes raw. It was chaotic, a panic. One of our own men, shooting wild, but I was the one who started it. I was the one who brought Eli there. I was the one who fired the shot that started the war. "But the poster," Clara said, confused. "It says manslaughter." "When the smoke cleared," Jesse said, his voice dead. "Cogan was dead. 2 of the Bar T men were dead, and my brother was dead." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And I was standing there, my gun still smoking. The law in that county. It is owned by the Bar T. They said I started it. They said I shot Cogan. And when the feud was over, they decided they did not like a man who could shoot that fast. Manslaughter was the word they used." "So you ran," Clara whispered. "I ran," he agreed. "I ran from the Bar T who wanted me dead. I ran from the law who wanted me hanging. And I ran from Eli's ghost." He looked at her, his face stripped bare. "I did not kill my brother, Clara, but I am the reason he is dead. That is a truth the law does not care about. It is a thing. It is a thing that does not wash off." Clara looked at him. She saw no monster. She saw a man hollowed out by grief. She saw the same guilt she carried in her own belly. The fear she had felt was gone, replaced by a sudden, aching recognition. She stood up from the cot, walked to the fire, and sat on the small stool, across from him. She held her own blistered, burned hands out to the weak warmth. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "It does not." He looked at her, confused by the lack of judgment, the absence of terror. "The town you found me outside of," she said, "Jubilee Creek. They call me a curse. My first husband, Thomas. He was a good man, a kind man. He died of fever. Left me with nothing but his good name and a pile of debt." She traced the grain of the wooden stool. I was made to marry Gideon Blackwood. An arrangement. He was an old man, and he wanted a wife to keep his house. I was a young woman who needed to eat. So I stood in that church. I did what I had to do." She paused, the memory sharp and bitter. "The town, they talk. They said he died in a bar brawl over cards. That is the story they tell." "But it is not the truth," Jessie said, watching her. "No," Clara said. "It is not. After the wedding, we were in the saloon. He was celebrating. A drunk man named Tully. He came over. He knew Gideon. He looked at me, and he put his hand on my arm. He smiled, and he said, "Is this the new property? Blackwood?" "She has hardly broken in." He was coarse. She was trembling now, but her voice was steady. "Gideon, I did not love him. I barely knew him, but he stood up. He told Tully to take his hand off me. He said, 'She is Mrs. Blackwood. You will show respect.'" Tully laughed. He said no wife of his would be in a saloon if she was respectable. And he grabbed me. He tried to pull me onto his lap. "Clara," Jessie whispered. "Gideon shoved him, hard. He was protecting me. Or protecting his name. It does not matter." Tully fell back, and he pulled a knife. Gideon was not a young man. He saw the knife, and he grabbed for a chair. But Tully lunged. Gideon stepped back, tripped over a spittoon, and he fell. He hit his head on the stove. Just like that. She looked at Jessie, her eyes wide and dry. "Tully ran. The marshal. He asked me what happened. I told him. But Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, she said I was a disruption. She said I had tempted Tully. She said a decent woman would have been at home." The whispers started before Gideon was even cold. The curse. She lured him in, and he died. She tempted Tully, and it killed her husband. They did not believe me. They wanted me to be guilty. It was easier than believing the world was just a hard, cruel place. She finally looked up at him. "So you see," she whispered, "I am no stranger to guilt. I am no stranger to being hunted." They sat in silence. The drip, drip, drip of the thaw was the only sound. The fire crackled. Two people, judged and damned by the world, sat across from each other, finally telling the truth. The shared pain was a stronger bond than any comfort could have been. The sound came 2 days later. It was mid-afternoon. The thaw had turned the world to a gray, wet mess of mud and melting snow. Clara was washing the tin plates when she heard it. The jingle of a harness, the wet thud of horses' hooves in the slush. Jessie heard it, too. He was on his feet in an instant. He did not look like a grieving man. He looked like a wolf that had heard the snap of a trap. His hand went to the gun at his hip. "Who?" Clara whispered, her blood running cold. Get away from the window," he snapped. He peered through a crack in the logs. His body went rigid. Damn it all." "What?" "Riders. 4 of them. One looks like Marshall Davies, from Jubilee Creek." Clara's heart stopped. "Me," she said. "They are looking for me." "Maybe." Jessie's eyes were scanning the room, frantic. "Or maybe they are just looking. They see the smoke. They are looking for you, or they are looking for me." He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "No," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "If you shoot, they will kill you." "If they find me, I hang," he said, his voice flat. "The barn," she said, thinking fast. "The lean-to. Go, now. Hide in the hayloft." "They will search it." "Not if they are only looking for me," she pleaded. "Go, Jessie, please. I will talk to them." He looked at her, his face torn. He did not want to run. He did not want to leave her, but he saw the truth in her words. He gave her one sharp, desperate nod. He unlatched the back window, a small square barely big enough for a man, and slipped out, sinking into the deep drift behind the cabin. He was gone, silent as a shadow. Clara took a deep breath, pressing her hands to her apron. She was alone. She heard a heavy knock on the door. "Hello? Anyone in there?" a deep voice called. She wiped her trembling hands and opened the door. 4 men sat on horseback, their figures dark against the gray sky. The man in front was older, with a thick gray mustache and a silver star pinned to his wet coat. Marshall Davies. He looked tired. His eyes widened in recognition, then relief. "Miss Monroe? Clara! My God! We thought the prairie had taken you." "Marshall," she said, her voice small. She clutched her coat tighter. "You have been here this whole time?" he asked, dismounting. The other men stayed on their horses, their eyes scanning the cabin, the lean-to, the tree line. "Yes," Clara lied. The word felt like acid on her tongue. "The blizzard. It came so fast. I found this place. It was empty. I took shelter." The marshal looked at the thin plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe. "You have been alone for more than a week. How did you survive?" There was some food left here. Firewood." She hated the lies. Each one felt like a betrayal. One of the other men, a deputy she did not know, squinted at the lean-to. "Marshal, there is a horse in there. A bay." The marshal's gaze sharpened. He looked from the horse to Clara. His kind eyes turned hard. "Alone, Miss Monroe?" Clara's heart was in her throat. I... "Clara," he said, his voice quiet, disappointed. "We are not just looking for you. We got a wire 2 days ago. A man named Jesse Klein, wanted for manslaughter. He was tracked heading into these foothills just before the storm hit. You seen anyone like that?" She could feel Jesse hiding just yards away. She could feel his life in her hands. She thought of his confession. She thought of her own. She thought of the town that had called her a curse. She looked Marshal Davies square in the eye. "I have seen no one. Marshal," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I have been alone. The horse. It was here when I arrived. It must belong to the man who owns this cabin. He must have left before the storm." The marshal stared at her. He knew she was lying. She could see it in his eyes. He saw the flush in her cheeks, the tremble in her hands. He looked at the cabin, small and cramped, and then back at her. He saw a woman who had been through an ordeal. He saw a widow. He did not see an accomplice. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "This man, Klein, he is dangerous. If you see him, you do not approach. You ride straight for town. You understand?" "Yes, Marshal," she whispered. "We will send a wagon for you tomorrow," he said, turning to remount his horse. "The creek is too high to cross safely today. You will be all right here for one more night." "Yes," she said, "I will be fine." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. I am sorry about Mr. Blackwood. Clara, it was a terrible thing." "Yes," she said, "it was." He turned his horse. "Let's ride, boys. Nothing here." She watched them go, the horses slipping in the mud, until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding. She sank against the doorframe, her legs weak. She felt the full, crushing weight of her choice. She had lied to the law. She had protected a man the world called a killer. She had chosen a side, and she was not sure if it was the right one. He did not come back until long after dark. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, and the dripping had turned to a steady rush as the creek began to swell. He slipped in the door like a ghost, his clothes soaked, his face gray with cold. He did not look at her. He went straight to the fire, his hands shaking violently. Clara said nothing. She poured him the last of the coffee, her hands steady now, and handed him the cup. He drank it in 3 long gulps. They stood in the silence, the distance between them wider than it had ever been. "He knew you were lying," Jesse said at last, his back to her. "Yes," she said. "Why?" I do not know." He turned around. His face was a mask of exhaustion and a kind of broken gratitude she had never seen. "You saved my life," he said. "You lied. For me. You could be arrested." "I know," she whispered. "He is coming back tomorrow, with a wagon, for you." "I know." The words hung in the air. For you, not for him. The thaw was here. The world was back, and it was coming to separate them. He took a step toward her. "Clara." She did not know what broke her. It was his thanks. It was the fear. It was the crushing loneliness of the lie. It was the thought of the wagon. It was the thought of being alone again. A sob tore from her chest, raw and ugly. It surprised them both. Tears, hot and sudden, streamed down her face. She covered her mouth, ashamed. I, she stammered. I do not know what is right anymore. I do not know. She looked up at him, her vision blurring. I buried Thomas. I watched Gideon fall. I cannot stand losing another person. I cannot. She did not finish. She did not have to. He closed the distance between them. He did not reach for her with desire. He reached for her with the same pained recognition they had shared by the fire. He put his arms around her. Clara collapsed against him, her face pressing into the cold, damp wool of his coat. She clutched the front of his shirt, her body shaking with a week's worth of held-back terror and grief. Jesse held her. His arms were tight around her, his one hand pressing her head against his shoulder. He held her as if she were the only thing in the world keeping him from flying apart. He was trembling just as hard as she was. It was not a kiss, it was not passion. It was two broken, guilty souls clinging to each other in the dark, in a world that had no place for them. It was tears, and the warmth of a shared breath, and the desperate, silent confession that they were well and truly, and perhaps hopelessly, lost. The wagon from Jubilee Creek never came. The thaw, which had begun as a hopeful drip, turned into a roaring deluge. The creek Jesse had crossed half-frozen became a churning, impassable river of brown water and ice floes. They were cut off. The world had returned, but it could not reach them. A strange, fragile peace settled over the cabin. The storm was gone, and the marshal could not cross the water. They were suspended in a quiet pocket of time, a life that belonged to neither the past nor the future. The silence between them was different now. After their embrace in the dark, the awkwardness was gone, replaced by a deep, humming awareness. They still kept their distance, but their movements were no longer about avoidance. They were orbits. Two bodies pulled by a gravity they had both silently agreed not to test. The spring, such as it was in the high country, began to show itself. The snow receded from the cabin, leaving behind a world of thick, sucking mud and the pale, bruised green of new grass. Jesse began to work. He was a man who needed to have his hands busy, lest his mind consume him. He started rebuilding the small corral attached to the lean-to. Eli had built it, and the storm had collapsed one side. Clara would watch him from the doorway, the sound of his hammer a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the quiet valley. He was mending, putting something broken back together. Clara, too, felt the pull of the season. She could not be idle. In the lean-to, she found a small, moldering canvas sack in a crate of Eli's belonging. Inside were seeds, bean and squash, dry and rattling. A flicker of hope, so sharp it was almost painful, went through her. She took the shovel Jesse used for the snow and found a patch of earth on the south side of the cabin, where the sun hit strongest. The ground was rocky and cold, but it was ground. She turned the soil, her hands, still tender, aching from the work. She planted the seeds in small, hopeful rows. It was a foolish act. They would be gone before anything could grow. But it was an act of faith. It was a claim on a future, however small. They ate their meals together at the small, rough-hewn table. They talked, not of their pasts, not of the law, but of small, immediate things, the quality of the light, the way Silas, his limp almost gone, favored the new grass, the progress of the fence. "The top rail needs to be replaced," he would say, his voice low. "The pine is rotted through." "I saw a good, straight aspen fall by the creek," she would reply, her eyes on her plate. "It is sound." They were like a husband and a wife, playing at a life that was not theirs. Every shared glance, every simple word, was a danger. They both knew it, This fragile piece was glass, and the world was a stone, waiting to be thrown. The stone arrived 2 weeks after the storm. The creek had finally lowered. The mud was beginning to dry. Clara was returning from the creek, a bucket of clear water in each hand. When she heard the horses, it was not the single, plodding sound of Jesse returning from checking a snare. It was the rhythmic, determined sound of riders who knew where they were going. Her blood went cold. She dropped the buckets and ran, stumbling in the mud, toward the cabin.
"Jesse!"
she screamed.
"Riders!"
He came out of the lean-to, the hammer in his hand. He did not run. He just turned his head, listening. He looked at the ridge, and his whole body went still.
"Inside, Clara,"
he said, his voice flat. "Now." "It is them," she breathed, grabbing his arm.
"Marshal Davies."
"Get inside." He pushed her gently toward the door and followed, his rifle in his hand. He did not bar the door. He just stood by the cold stove, the rifle held loose at his side, and waited. 2 horses stopped outside. The jingle of harness was loud in the sudden silence. A heavy boot hit the porch. The knock on the door was not a question. It was a command. Clara opened it. Marshal Davies stood there, his face carved from granite. The weary kindness was gone. Beside him stood another man, younger, with a cold, pale face and a store-bought suit under his duster. This man's eyes missed nothing. "Clara," the marshal said. He did not call her Miss Monroe.
"Marshal,"
she said, her hands knotted in her apron. She blocked the doorway. "You lied to me," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple, damning fact. I do not know what you mean." "We found the rancher who sold Klein that bay gelding, Silas. He described the horse. He described the brand. It is the same horse in that lean-to. You have been harboring him, Clara, for weeks." The man in the suit stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, harboring a wanted fugitive is a federal crime. You are complicating your own life in ways you cannot imagine."
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice shaking. "Agent Thorne," the man said. "I am here on behalf of the territorial governor and the Bar T Ranch. This is no longer a local matter." Marshal Davies looked past her, into the cabin's dim interior.
"He is in there, is he not? Jesse Klein."
From the shadows, Jesse spoke. "I am here." He stepped forward, into the light. He did not raise the rifle. He just held it. Agent Thorne's hand moved to the revolver at his hip.
"Jesse,"
Clara whispered, stepping back, putting herself between them. "This does not concern her. Marshal," Jesse said. His voice was calm, but the cabin was electric with tension. "She found the cabin. I found her. The storm trapped us. She has done nothing." "She lied to a peace officer," Thorne said, his voice like ice. "That is obstruction." "She was scared," Jesse said. "You show up with 4 men. She is all alone." "She was not alone," Marshal Davies said. His eyes filled with a deep, cold disappointment. Clara realized, with a jolt, that he had known her since she was a girl. He had known her father. "I have known you your whole life. Clara, I knew your PA. I never figured you for a liar. Or this." "You do not know this," Clara said, and her fear suddenly burned away, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "Clara, do not," Jesse warned from behind her. "No," she said, turning to face the marshal fully. "You do not know him. You come here with your badge and your agent, and you wave a piece of paper. You know nothing." "I know he is wanted for manslaughter," the marshal said, his voice rising. "I know he killed a man. I know he is a fugitive."
"You know what the Bar T paid you to know?"
Clara shouted, her voice ringing in the clearing.
"Did you know he was defending his own brother? Did you know they were stealing his land?
His water? Did you know he has been running for 3 years from a ghost you and your laws helped make?" Marshal Davies was stunned into silence. Agent Thorne, however, looked unimpressed. The law is the law. Ma'am, his family disputes are not our concern. The warrant is for manslaughter." "Then you are a fool," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, trembling intensity. "You are all fools. You talk of law. You know nothing of justice. You know nothing of guilt." She looked at Davies, her eyes flashing. "The town whispered about me, did they not? The curse. You let them call me that when Gideon died protecting me. You stood by and watched them call me a temptation, a bad luck charm. You know what guilt is, Marshall. It is living with what you cannot change. And this man," she pointed back at Jesse, "has more honor in him than your whole town combined." "Clara!" Jesse's voice was a sharp crack. He stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. He was not looking at the officers. He was looking at her. "That is enough." She looked at him, her chest heaving. She saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her, for what she was doing. Marshal Davies looked at the hand on her shoulder. He looked at her fierce, tear-streaked face. His expression hardened with a final, sad understanding. "My God, child," he whispered. "You have not just lied. You have fallen in with him." "Get your things, ma'am," Agent Thorne said, his voice flat. "You are coming with us." "No," Jesse said. He stepped fully in front of her. The rifle was still pointing at the floor, but his grip on it was white. "You are not taking her." Thorne smiled, a thin, cold expression. "And you will stop us? Klein, there are 2 of us now. There are 10 more a day's ride back. Do you want her to watch you get shot, or do you want to hang?" "Leave her," Jesse said. I will go with you. No rifle, no trouble. Just leave her out of it. She has been through enough." Clara grabbed his arm. "No, Jesse, no!" The marshal looked at Jesse. He looked at Clara. He looked at the half-mended fence and the small, pathetic patch of turned earth by the door. He scrubbed a hand over his face, his weariness suddenly profound. "Thorne," he said, "Marshal, she is an accomplice." "She is a grieving widow who was lost in a storm," Davies said, his voice full of gravel. "I am not arresting Clara Monroe. Not today. My God. What is this town coming to?" He looked at Jesse. "We are not taking you today, either. Klein." Jesse stared, confused. "What?" "The river is high," Davies said, nodding back the way he came. "The passes are mud. I'm not losing a horse and a prisoner just to satisfy the bar T today. But we will be back, when the ground is dry, and we will have more men. You," he said to Jesse, "would be smart to be long gone. And you," he said to Clara, his voice breaking with a frustration that bordered on pity, "would be smart to let him go. We will be back. Clara, do not make this harder on yourself than it already is." He turned, not waiting for a reply. He mounted his horse. Agent Thorne gave Clara a last, cold look. "You have been warned. Ma'am, you chose the wrong side." They wheeled their horses and rode away, their figures disappearing into the pines. The clearing was silent. The only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. Clara was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Jesse turned and pulled her inside. He kicked the door shut. He did not let go of her. He just stood there, his arms around her, and he was shaking, too. "Why?" he whispered into her hair. "Clara, why did you do that? You tore yourself apart for me." I could not let them," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I could not let them say those things." He held her for a long time. The fragile piece was gone. The glass was shattered. The world was coming, and it was coming for both of them. That night, they ate in silence. The food, rabbit stew from one of his snares, was tasteless. The small cabin, which had been their sanctuary, now felt like a trap. After, Jesse sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. his movements stiff. Clara sat on the cot, mending a tear in her skirt, her hands trembling so badly she kept missing the stitch. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dead. "I am leaving." Clara's needle stopped. "What?" "At dawn," he said, not looking at her. He was right. They will be back, and I will not let them find me here. I will not let them do to you what they threatened." "Do to me?" she said, standing up. "What about you? They will hang you, Jesse." "Maybe," he said. "But I have been running for 3 years. I am good at it. I will head north, into the territories. They will not find me." "So you are running again," she said, her voice flat. He looked up, and his eyes were full of a pain that was sharper than any anger. "I am not running," he said. I am saving you. Did you hear what they called you? Did you see how they looked at you? Fallen in with him. They see you as no better than me. If I stay, I destroy you. I ruin your name. I will make you an outcast, more than you already are." "My name?" she said, her voice rising, incredulous. "You think I care about my name? You think I care what Mrs. Abernathy whispers about me? I have nothing left. Jesse, that town, that world, it has nothing for me. It cast me out. You are the only one." She stopped, choking on the words. "Do not," he said, standing. "Do not say it. I am not what you think. I am a wanted man. I am a dead man. I am Eli's ghost. I told you, everything I touch, it turns to ash. I will not turn you to ash." "So you will just leave?" she cried. "You will just ride away and leave me here for them to find? For them to pity and accuse? You will leave me alone again?" "It is better than being seen with me," he said, his voice raw. "You are a coward!" she shouted, and the word cracked like a whip in the small room. He flinched, as if she had struck him. "A coward," she repeated, walking toward him, her hands clenched. "You think you are protecting me. You are protecting yourself. You are afraid. You are afraid to feel anything. You are afraid to live. You ran from the feud. You ran from your brother's memory. And now you are running from me." "Clara, that is not—" "It is," she yelled, tears of rage and grief streaming down her face. "You would rather face a noose than love." The word hung in the air, terrible and beautiful. "You are a coward, Jesse Klein," she whispered, her voice breaking, and she drew back her hand, and she slapped him. The sound was sharp, shocking. It echoed in the silence. He did not move. He did not even blink. He just stared at her, the red mark blooming on his cheek. His face was a mask of utter, profound devastation. He slowly, gently, took her wrists in his hands. His grip was firm, but it did not hurt. He just held her, stopping her from running, stopping her from striking him again. "Do not," he murmured, his voice broken. "Do not do that. Do not make this harder." He looked down at her wrists, his thumbs brushing against her pulse. "You deserve, God, Clara, you deserve safety. You deserve a home and children. You deserve a good man, a clean man, a man with a name, not a curse, not me. I am a dead man. All I am is a shadow." She looked at him. She saw his guilt. She saw his sacrifice. She saw the love he was trying to choke, the love he was running from, and she was filled with a fury that was so pure it was almost holy. She was furious at him, at the world, at the fate that would make such a good man see himself as nothing. She was trembling. She was furious, and she was, for the first time in her life, completely, terrifyingly alive. She lunged upward, pulling her wrists from his grasp, and grabbed the front of his shirt. She pulled his face down to hers, and she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hard. It was desperate. It was a brand. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the iron of his will. It was all the words she could not say. It was a claim. It was an accusation. It was a plea. It was not surrender. It was a declaration of war against the both of them, against the world. It was salvation. He was frozen for a heartbeat, shocked by her fury. And then something in him broke. The iron, the guilt, the years of running. It all shattered. He kissed her back. His arms went around her, pulling her so tight against him she could not breathe. His mouth was as desperate as hers, full of a hunger that was not just for her body, but for her life, for her fire. He lifted her off her feet, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her the few steps to the cot. They spent the night together. It was not an escape from their fate. It was a choice. It was two souls, damned by the world, choosing to be alive. Right here, right now, despite that damnation. It was not passion. It was a deeper, rawer thing. It was the frantic, desperate need to be seen, to be held, to be known, before the end came. It was tears, and whispered, broken words, and the simple, astonishing warmth of skin against skin. It was two people, finally, choosing to live, even if it was only for one night. The dawn found them quiet, their limbs tangled. The fire burned down to gray embers. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and clear. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, slow beat of his heart. They were exhausted. They were fragile. They were, in the cold light of morning, more doomed than they had ever been. They did not speak. They just lay there, quiet and awake in the gray light, knowing the world was coming. And this time, there would be no running. They had 3 days. 3 days where the world held its breath. The mud dried, the creek settled, and the new, green grass firmed up under their boots. They were 3 days of borrowed time, and they lived them not in fear, but in a state of quiet, sharp-edged clarity. They did not speak of the marshal. They did not speak of leaving. They woke in the small cot together, their bodies fitted in the gray light. They fixed the last rail on the corral. Clara watered the tiny, stubborn green shoots that were pushing up from the seeds she had planted. They were acts of faith, performed in the shadow of the inevitable. Every small, shared task, passing the coffee, his hand brushing hers as he took the hammer, was a memory, made even as it was happening. On the morning of the 4th day, the sound came. It was not the cautious approach of 2 riders. It was the steady, heavy tread of a half-dozen horses, moving with purpose. Jesse was splitting the last of the winter wood. He heard it and did not pause the axe, but his body went rigid. Clara, who was hanging a blanket to air, dropped it in the dirt. Their eyes met across the clearing. The time was over. "Go," Clara said, her voice a desperate whisper. "The hills. Like you said, I will tell them you left days ago. I will lie." He looked at her, then at the ridge. He could be gone in 10 minutes, lost in the pines where no posse could find him. He had been running for 3 years. He knew how. "Jesse, go!" she pleaded, running to him, grabbing the front of his shirt. He shook his head, a small, slow movement. "I am done running." You promised," she stammered, her mind racing back to their first night, the night of the kiss. "You said you would not let them." "I will not let them take me," he said. He grabbed his saddlebag from the lean-to. He checked his rifle. "But I am not running from them, not this time." "What are you doing?" "I am drawing them off," he said, his voice flat and hard. "I will lead them south. Give me an hour's head start. It is all I need. They want me, Clara, not you. Once they have my trail, they will forget all about this cabin. They will forget you." "No, Jesse." He grabbed her. He did not kiss her. He held her face between his rough, calloused hands and looked at her, memorizing her. "Live," he said. It was a command. "You plant those seeds. You live. Clara." He turned, grabbed the reins of Silas, and vaulted into the saddle. He did not look back. He kicked the horse into a run, heading not for the high, safe pines, but west, across the open flatland, a clear and obvious trail. Clara stood, frozen, her hand at her mouth. She watched him until he was a small, dark speck against the rising sun. 10 minutes later, the posse rode into the clearing. There were 6 of them, led by Marshal Davies. He looked older, his face etched with a grim, joyless duty. He saw Clara, standing alone by the woodpile, the dropped blanket at her feet. He dismounted, his movements heavy. "Clara!" She did not answer. She just stared at him, her face pale and empty.
Where is he?
The marshal demanded. Clara looked at him. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. All that was left was a cold, hard stillness. "He is gone."
Which way?
One of the deputies snapped. Clara said nothing. "Ma'am," the marshal said, his voice softening, "do not do this. I have a warrant, not just for him. I have one for you." This cut through her numbness. For me? Harboring a fugitive, obstruction of justice, lying to a federal officer. He pulled the paper from his coat. "You are an accomplice. Clara, in the eyes of the law, you are no different from him." He stepped toward her. "I do not want to do this. I knew your father, but my patience is gone. Tell me which way he rode, and I will tear this paper up. I will tell them you were a hostage. I will fix this for you." Clara thought of Jesse, riding west. She thought of his words. "Live." She looked the marshal in the eye. "I will not." His face hardened. "Clara, you are forcing my hand. You are a young woman. You are a widow. Do you know what they do to women in the territorial prison?" "I will tell you nothing," she said, her voice quiet.
Damn it, girl!
He roared, his frustration finally breaking.
He is a killer. He has poisoned you.
"He is a better man than you," she whispered. The marshal's face went dark. He had lost. He turned to his men. "She has made her choice. Arrest her." 2 deputies dismounted. They moved toward her, their faces awkward. "Ma'am, please do not—" "I will not," she said again. She put her hands behind her back. The deputy, shame-faced, tied her wrists with a short length of rope. Marshal Davies looked around the clearing, at the half-mended fence, at the tiny green shoots by the cabin wall. He shook his head, his face a mask of bitter duty. "You could have had a life. Clara, he took that from you too." "No," she said as they led her to a horse. "He is the only one who ever gave me one." They put her on the horse and led her away from the cabin, heading east, back to Jubilee Creek. Jesse was not riding west. He had cut into a dry wash half a mile out, circled back and climbed the ridge overlooking the valley. He lay flat on the scree, his rifle resting on a rock. Watching, he was a shadow against the stone. He saw the posse. He saw them surround the cabin. He saw them talking to Clara. He held his breath, praying she would lie, that she would point west, that they would take the bait. And then he saw it. He saw the deputies move toward her. He saw them tie her hands. He saw them lift her onto a horse. No. The word was a silent scream in his mind. No, not her. He had done this. His plan, his desperate attempt to save her, had failed. He had not drawn them off. He had only left her defenseless. He had run, and she was paying the price. They were taking her. They were taking her to jail. For him. He watched the small procession ride out of the valley. He watched her back straight, her head high, roped to a saddle, a prisoner. He realized she was not just lying for him. She was sacrificing herself for him. She, who had been judged and cursed and abandoned, was willing to go to prison, to lose everything, for a man the world called a killer. His guilt, the constant, cold companion of 3 years, was suddenly eclipsed by a new, burning shame. He had been running to save his own life. She was standing still to save his. He lowered his head and pressed it against the cold stock of his rifle. He could not let this happen. He could not let the one person who had seen him as a man be destroyed by him. He was a dead man. He had known that for 3 years. But he could choose the ground he died on, and it would not be on a high ridge, running, while she was taken in his place. He would not save her from the law. The law was a lie. He would save her from the injustice that was devouring them both. He stood, his figure stark against the morning sky. He did not run. He began a steady, determined descent toward Jubilee Creek, following the tracks of the posse, a ghost coming in from the cold. Jubilee Creek was loud that night. The Red Dog Saloon was full, the air thick with smoke, whiskey, and the excited, cruel murmur of gossip. They had brought Clara to the marshal's office, which was just a railed-off corner of the saloon. There was no real jail, just 2 small cells in the back, and the saloon was the only place large enough to hold the town. Clara sat on a bench, her hands untied, but a deputy at her back. She was the center of attention. "That is her," a woman whispered from a table. "The cursed bride. I told you, first Monroe, then Blackwood, and now she is caught with a killer. Shameful." "Mrs." Abernathy said, fanning herself, though the air was cool. "She has no decency, lying to the marshal, living with that man." "What I hear," a rancher slurred, "is that Klein is a hard one. Killed his own brother, they say." "That is not what I heard," another man countered, one of the smallholders from the South Range. "I heard the Bar T pushed him. I heard it was a fair fight." Marshal Davies sat at his desk, his face grim. He was not interrogating Clara. He was waiting. He knew the pressure of the town, the whispers, the staring, would break her. "Clara," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear, "this is your last chance. We have a wire. The territorial judge will be here in 2 days. You sign a statement. You testify against Klein, and I will see what I can do. I will tell him you were coerced. I will tell him you were afraid." Clara looked at the floorboards. "I have nothing to say."
"You are going to prison, child," he hissed. "For him."
"Then I will go."
"Why?"
he demanded, his voice full of a desperate, angry confusion.
"Why are you throwing your life away for a murderer?"
"Because you are wrong," she said, her voice clear, and the saloon quieted to hear her. "He is not." The main doors of the saloon crashed open. They flew back, hitting the walls with a sound like a gunshot. Every man spun, hands dropping to their holsters. Jesse Klein stood in the doorway. He was drenched, his clothes plastered to him from fording the creek. His hair was matted, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a cold, exhausted fire. He was not a gunslinger. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. He held his rifle in one hand, barrel pointed at the floor. The saloon was dead silent. "Klein," the marshal breathed, standing, drawing his revolver. "I am not here to fight. Marshal?" Jesse said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room. He looked past Davies, past the guns, to Clara. He saw the shock on her face, the sudden, terrible hope. "I am here for her." "You are under arrest," Davies said. "I know." Jesse walked forward. The crowd parted, men stumbling back to give him room. He did not look at them. He walked to the desk, placed his rifle on it, and unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy Colt thudded onto the wood. He stood before the marshal, unarmed. "Let her go."
"No, Jesse!"
Clara screamed, lunging forward, but the deputy grabbed her.
"Run! God! Jesse, run!"
He looked at her, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. "It is all right. Clara, I am done running." He turned to the marshal. "To the hole. Watching town." "She has done nothing. She found my cabin. I found her near dead in the snow. The storm trapped us. She lied because she was scared, and because I asked her to. This is all on me. Let her walk out that door." You admit the charge?" Davies asked, his hand still on his pistol, his face a mask of confusion. "What charge?" Jesse asked. "The one the bar T paid for, the charge of manslaughter?" He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the small ranchers in the back. "You all know the bar T. You know Mr. Barton. You know he has been fencing open range for 5 years. That is ranch business." The bar T foreman, a man named Shaw, growled from the bar. "It was my brother's business." Jesse shot back. "It was our land. Barton fenced the Clear Fork. He was starving us out. My brother, Eli. He rode to cut the wire. Barton sent gunmen to stop him. Hired men, not ranchers. Killers."
"Lies!"
Shaw shouted. "Is it?" Jesse said. "I was there. I rode with him. They ambushed us. 12 guns against 6. A man named Cogan aimed at my brother. I fired. I shot Cogan to save my brother's life."
"You murdered him," Shaw yelled.
"He was a hired gun," Jesse said, his voice dropping. "And I would do it again, but that is not why I am a wanted man. I am wanted because my brother died." He paused, and the room was so quiet they could hear the hiss of the lanterns. "Eli was shot," Jesse said, his voice raw. "Not by Cogan. He was shot in the back, by a rifle, from the rocks. One of Barton's men, a cover-up. They murdered him. And because I was the only one left standing, because I had dared to fight back, they put the warrant on me. They stole our land. They murdered my brother. And they called me the criminal. And this marshal, this law." They were happy to serve the paper. A profound, tense silence filled the room. The town was split. The bar T-men, the banker, Mrs. Abernathy. They saw a killer, confessing, the smallholders, the dirt farmers, the men who had been pushed around by Barton. They saw a man defending his honor. He is telling the truth," Clara sobbed. It was self-defense. It was an injustice." She ran to him, grabbing his arm. "Marshal, please," she pleaded. "Listen to him. He is a good man. He saved my life. He is telling the truth." Marshal Davies looked at Jesse. He looked at Clara. He looked at the angry face of the bar T foreman. The warrant in his hand was legal. The confession was public. His hands were tied. "Jesse Klein," the marshal said, his voice heavy as stone. "You have publicly confessed to the killing of a man, by the authority of the Montana Territory. I sentence you to hang." Clara's plea turned into a thin, keening wail. "No!" "When?" Jesse asked. He did not look at the marshal. He looked at Clara. "Sunrise." They took him to the small cell in the back. Clara was pushed out into the saloon, which erupted in a low, furious murmur. She was free. He was not. She waited. Hours. She sat on the steps of the mercantile across the street, watching the jail. The town went to sleep. The saloon emptied. The lights went out. One lantern remained lit in the marshal's office, where the young deputy, Harris, sat watch. Just after 2 in the morning, she moved. She crept across the street, into the dark office. Harris was asleep at the desk, his head on his arms, or he was pretending. She did not care. She slipped past him, into the back. The cell was a small iron cage. Jesse was not sleeping. He was standing, his hands on the bars, looking out the tiny, high window at a sliver of moon. "Jesse," she whispered. He turned. His face in the moonlight was so tired. He looked peaceful. He came to the bars. "You should not be here," he whispered. I could not." She pressed her hands against the cold iron. He reached through and covered her hands with his. His skin was cold. "I am sorry," she sobbed, pressing her forehead against the bars. "I am so sorry. Jesse, this is my fault. I should have... I do not know. I should have done something."
"No,"
he said, his voice firm, his thumbs rubbing the backs of her hands. "This is not your fault. This is just the end of the road. I was tired of running. Clara, I was so tired." "What will I do?" she whispered, the tears hot on her cheeks. I cannot go back to being alone. I cannot." "You are not," he said. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You faced them all down. You looked at me. Not the curse, not the killer. You saw me." "I love you," she whispered, the words tearing out of her. "I love you. Do not leave me." A single tear cut a path through the grime on his cheek. He leaned his head against the bars, his eyes closing. "Do not love a dead man. Clara." "I will," she said, her sobs hardening into that familiar, fierce defiance. "I will. And I will live. I promise you, I will. I will stay. I will not let them run me out. I will plant those seeds. I will live for both of us." He opened his eyes. "Good," he breathed. "That is good. When you came to the cabin, I thought I was just bringing more death inside. I thought you were just another ghost." He looked at her, and the smile he gave her was the most painful, beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I was wrong. You were not the curse. Clara, you were the grace. You already saved me. Do you understand? You saved me the moment you looked at me and were not afraid. I am not afraid. Not anymore."
"Ma'am."
Deputy Harris was standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands.
"Ma'am, you should go. It is almost time."
Clara clung to Jesse's hands. "No, please, not yet." "Go, Clara," Jesse said, his voice gentle. He pulled his hands from hers. "Go, and do not watch. Please, remember me here, like this." "I will not leave you," she said, her voice breaking. "Live," he said. It was his last command. "That is all I ask. Live." She could not speak. She kissed his fingers through the bars, her lips tasting the cold iron. "I promise," she whispered. She turned. She walked past the deputy, who would not look at her. She walked out of the jail, into the gray, frozen air of the false dawn. The town was dark, but on the edge of the street, near the creek, a new, stark shape stood against the sky, a gallows. The morning was not a sunrise. It was a dilution. The black of the high country night did not give way to light, but to a bruised, indeterminate gray. And with the gray, the snow returned. It did not fall with the driving, violent fury of the blizzard. It fell in small, exhausted flakes, spiraling down without purpose, a cruel circle closing, a final, cold shroud for a world that had no mercy. The gallows stood on the edge of town, near the creek. It was a new, raw pine structure, built 3 years prior for a different man. It loomed against the gray sky, a stark, three-sided question. Clara stood across the street, in front of the locked-up mercantile. She had not moved for hours. She had watched the sky turn from black to gray. She was frozen, not with the cold that seeped through her worn coat and thin boots, but with a stillness that had hollowed her out. She had wept all her tears in the jail. There was nothing left. She had promised him she would live. But the word was a meaningless sound, a puff of vapor in the icy air. How could she live when she was about to watch the world end? The town emerged, one by one. They came not in anger, but in a grim, quiet curiosity. They were ghosts in the swirling snow. Mrs. Abernathy, her face pinched. Mrs. Sweeney, the undertaker's wife, who looked at the gallows with a professional, assessing eye, the Bar T foreman. Shaw stood near the front, his arms crossed, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Agent Thorne was there, his store-bought coat buttoned high, a representative of a distant, bloodless law. And the smallholders, the dirt farmers, they stood in the back, their hats in their hands, their faces grim. They were not here for the spectacle. They were here to bear witness. At 6:30, the door of the marshal's office opened. Clara's heart, which she thought had stopped, gave a single, violent lurch. Marshal Davies walked out first. He looked like a man who had not slept in a year. His face was gray. His star was dull. He was followed by Deputy Harris, who was pale and shaking, his eyes on the ground. And then Jesse. His hands were tied in front of him. He was wearing his own coat, the one she had mended. He had not slept. She could see the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes. But he was clean. He had washed his face and combed his hair with his fingers. He stopped on the boardwalk and looked at the sky. He took a deep breath of the cold, snowy air, and he walked. He did not stumble. He did not look at the ground. He walked with his head high, his broad shoulders set. The wind snapped at the hem of his coat. He looked like a man walking to a job, not to his death. He looked like the man who had pulled her from the snow. Clara felt a sound rise in her throat, a scream, a plea. She swallowed it down. It felt like choking on broken glass. She had promised she would not add her tears to his burden. He walked through the small path cleared in the snow. The crowd was silent. The only sound was the crunch of his boots, the sigh of the wind, and the small, metallic jingle of the marshal's spurs. He reached the gallows. He stopped at the base of the 13 steps. He looked for her. His eyes scanned the crowd, past the hard faces, past the curious, past the pitiless. He found her. He held her gaze. In his eyes, she saw no fear. She saw no anger. She saw only a profound, heartbreaking calm. He had meant what he said. He was at peace. He looked at her, and his eyes said what his voice could not: live. He gave her a single, slow nod. Acknowledgement, farewell, love. He turned from her and mounted the steps, one by one. Marshal Davies followed him. He unrolled a piece of paper. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse. By the authority of the territory of Montana, the sentence for the crime of manslaughter, confessed by the prisoner. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out. He looked at Jesse. Do you have any last words? Prisoner. Jesse looked out, not at the crowd, but over their heads, to the mountains in the west, their peaks hidden by the snow. I said my truth, he said, his voice clear and strong. I am done talking. Will you have the hood? The marshal asked, his hand trembling as he held up a black sack. Jesse looked at him. No. He would not die in the dark. The marshal's hands were shaking so badly he could barely manage the rope. He looped the thick, stiff noose over Jesse's head, settling it around his neck. Jesse did not flinch. He just watched Clara. Clara pressed her fist to her mouth. She was shaking. She was vibrating. She was going to fly apart. She prayed. Not for mercy. She knew none was coming. She prayed for strength. She prayed for the ground to open up. She prayed for it to be over. Stop! The voice was a raw, strangled cry. A gunshot cracked the gray silence. Every head snapped. The marshal froze, his hand on the lever. Deputy Harris stood on the boardwalk, his revolver in his hand, pointed at the gray sky. He was weeping, his whole body racked with violent, choking sobs. Stop! He screamed again. In the name of God, stop! He is innocent! Harris, what in... Marshal Davies roared. He is innocent, Harris cried, stumbling forward, his face a mess of tears and snot. He pointed a shaking finger, not at Jesse, but at the Bar T foreman. Shaw, he lied. They all lied. The deputy is drunk, Agent Thorne said, his voice sharp,
Proceed, Marshal. I am not drunk, Harris yelled. I am damned, but I will not see this. I was there. I was at the Clear Fork. I was 16. I was one of Barton's new riders. I was there. The town was silent. Jesse stood on the platform, the rope around his neck, watching the man who had led him from his cell. It was like he said. Harris choked out, the words tumbling over each other. Cogan was a killer. He drew on Eli Klein. Jesse shot him. It was defense. And then the shot from the rocks. I saw it. I saw Shaw. He pointed again. I saw him on the ridge with a rifle. He shot Eli in the back. It was murder, a setup.
That is a lie,
Shaw bellowed, his face purple. The boy is crazy. It is the truth, Harris screamed. And you paid us. You and Barton. You paid me $50 to keep my mouth shut. You paid me to say I saw Jesse shoot his own brother in the chaos. It was a lie. It was all a lie. The land theft. The murder. It was all of you. A low, dangerous growl rose from the back of the crowd, from the smallholders. Agent Thorne drew his pistol. This is an insurrection. Marshal, do your duty. But Marshal Davies was not looking at Thorne. He was looking at Harris, a man he had known and trusted. He saw the raw, unadulterated truth in his confession. He looked at Shaw, who was sweating despite the cold. He looked at Jesse, standing tall, the rope around his neck. And the marshal, a man broken by a lifetime of compromises, lowered his eyes. He was ashamed. He turned, slowly. He walked back to Jesse. He pulled a knife from his belt. He did not look at Jesse's face. He looked at the rope. And with one sharp movement, he cut it. The rope fell, useless, into the snow on the platform. Jesse did not move. He just stood there. He had been ready. He had been gone. And now he was back. His legs gave out. He did not fall, but he crumpled, grabbing the railing of the scaffold, his body shaking with a violent, delayed shock. He was not dying. He was alive. No! Clara's voice, it was not a plea. It was a roar. She ran. She pushed through the stunned crowd, her hands outstretched. She did not stop at the steps. She scrambled up the platform, falling, and threw her arms around Jesse's waist, burying her face in his coat. He is alive, she wept, her voice muffled. He is alive. He is alive. Jesse could not speak. He just held her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his body trembling, as the world he had left behind came rushing back in. The execution was halted. It was not a victory. It was a collapse. Agent Thorne, seeing the mood of the crowd and the marshal's gray face, quietly mounted his horse and rode out of town. The Bar T foreman, Shaw, was surrounded by 3 angry smallholders, and for once in his life, he did not fight. He was arrested, put in the very cell Jesse had just vacated. Deputy Harris sat on the steps of the jail, his head in his hands, a free man and a broken one. Marshal Davies, his face like old parchment, walked over to Jesse, who was now sitting on the gallows steps. Clara beside him, her hand locked in his. Klein, the marshal said, his voice so low they could barely hear him. You are free to go. The warrant is void. Jesse just looked at him. He looked at the man who had been ready to hang him. He said nothing. The marshal stammered. I was following the law. Your law is a lie, Clara said, her voice flat. The marshal flinched, but did not argue. He just nodded. His shoulders slumped and walked away. Jesse was free, but he was broken. The town had not saved him. A single, guilty conscience had. He and Clara sat there for a long time, the snow falling on their shoulders, until the crowd dispersed, whispering, arguing, dividing. The town remained split. Some saw Jesse as a hero, a man who had faced down the Bar T and won. They brought him drinks.
slapped his back. But to others, to the decent folk like Mrs. Abernathy, he was still the killer. And Clara? Clara was worse. She was no longer the cursed bride. She was the killer's woman. She had lived with him. She had screamed for him. She had defended him. She had cast her lot, and she was, in their eyes, just as fallen as he was. She was an outcast, more so than she had ever been when she was just a convenient widow. She had held up a mirror to their town, and they hated her for it. They stayed in the boarding house for 2 days. The quiet was deafening. Jesse sat in a chair by the window, not moving, just staring at the mountains. He had been so close to death that life felt strange, ill-fitting. Clara watched him. She saw that the man who had come down from the mountain was not the same man who sat in this room. The fire was gone, replaced by a deep, cold ash. On the 3rd morning, he stood up. "I am selling Silas," he said. Clara's head snapped up. "What? No, Jesse, your horse. He is all you have." "He is not all I have," he said, and he looked at her. It was the first time he had truly looked at her since the gallows. I cannot stay here, and I cannot take you back to that cabin. It is full of ghosts. Eli's, mine." "Then we will go," she said. "We have no money. We have nothing." "We have this," she said, and she took his hand. He sold Silas. He sold the saddle, the rifle, the heavy Colt revolver. He sold every piece of his old life, every burden he had carried. He got $40 for the lot. He spent 10 on a new axe, a bag of flour, salt, and 2 thick wool blankets. He came back to Clara. He had no horse. He had no gun. He had a sack of supplies, and he had her. They left Jubilee Creek that afternoon. They did not ride. They walked. They walked out of the town, past the gallows, which was already being dismantled. They walked past the mercantile and the church. They did not look back. They walked west, toward the wide, unknown valley that lay beyond the mountains. They built a new life, not from the ashes of the old, but from the raw, new ground. The spring was hard. They found a valley, watered by a creek that ran clean and fast. They built a new cabin, a sod house at first, like the one she had shared with Thomas, then a small, tight one-room shelter of pine. The work was brutal. Jesse cut the trees, his body, gaunt from the winter, slowly regaining its strength. Clara, her hands raw and bleeding, chinked the logs with mud and moss. They planted the seeds she had salvaged from her apron pocket, the ones from Eli's old sack. Their lives were quiet. The scars remained. So, Jesse, he was quiet. He had left his guilt at the gallows, but the shadow of the rope was long. He seldom spoke of that day, but Clara would find him standing by the creek, just watching the water, his face 1,000 miles away. He did not touch a gun. He hunted with snares. And Clara, she was no longer afraid. She had faced down a town, a law, and death itself. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of the wind and the creek. But the memory of his face, high on that platform, was a scar on her heart that would never fade. They were 2 broken people, living in a quiet, broken peace. They were not healed, but they were together. The winter came again, harsh and cold, the wind moving through the pines. But the cabin was tight, the wood pile was high. One cold evening, the fire crackled in the stove, the one thing they had allowed themselves from a mail-order catalog. The room was warm. Clara dragged the small tin tub, the one they had bought with the money from Jesse's snares, into the center of the room. She filled it with water, heated on the stove. It was the same scene from that first, terrible winter, but it was all different. Jesse sat on the stool, watching her. His eyes were not averted. They were steady. When the tub was full, Clara did not move to undress. She sat on the edge of her cot, and she held out her hands. They were not the soft, blistered hands of the woman he had found. They were red, scarred, the knuckles swollen from hauling rock and splitting wood. They were the hands that had built their home. Jesse looked at her. He understood. He knelt. He did not sleep by the fire anymore. He slept in the bed, beside her, but this was different. He knelt before her, as if in prayer. He took the wooden cup, dipped it in the warm water, and poured it slowly over her hands, washing away the dust and the grime. He took the small piece of lye soap and gently, carefully, washed her hands, his touch rough but incredibly tender. He washed her wrists. He washed the small, white scar on her right hand, the one from the kettle. Their eyes met in the firelight. It was the same spark, the same awareness from that first night in the cabin. The longing, the fear, but the fear was gone. The shame was gone. All that was left was the warmth. Clara looked down at his dark head, at his strong hands holding hers, and a small, quiet smile touched her face. The last of the ice in her heart, finally, truly, melted. Her whisper was for him alone, lost in the sound of the fire and the wind outside. You did touch me, and I do not regret it. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. It was harsh, it was endless, but it was no longer empty. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to connect with all of you, so please comment with where you are listening from. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.